Chapter 14, Jihad. Even as my friends and I were looking for ways to reach out across the Christian-Muslim divide, the world, it seemed, was rapidly growing more polarized than ever, making the task both more urgent and more difficult. From the day the planes hit the towers, the conflict was cast in terms of world war. On September 12th, less than 24 hours after the attacks, NATO invoked Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty and declared that the actions against the World Trade Center and the Pentagon were in fact hostilities taken against all 19 membership countries of NATO. The White House immediately began talking about a, quote, global war on terror, end quote. In an address to a joint session of Congress on September 20th, President Bush declared that this war, quote, will not end until every terrorist group of the global reach has been found and defeated, end quote.
Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated.
By October 7th, less than a month after the attacks in New York and Washington, D.C., we had invaded Afghanistan.
Good afternoon. On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against Al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
In an address a few days later, the president said, quote, the world has come together to fight a new and different war, end quote. But what exactly was this global war? New, how? Different, why? To much of the Muslim East, as my growing circle of Muslim friends pointed out, this looked like a very old war indeed, the one initiated not by Muslim militants, but by the West. On Sunday, September 16th, President Bush told reporters, quote, this crusade, this war on terrorism, is going to take a while, end quote.
This crusade, this war on terrorism, is going to take a while. And the American people must be patient. I'm going to be patient. But I can assure the American people, I am determined. I'm not going to be distracted. I will keep my focus to make sure that not only are these brought to justice, but anybody who's been associated will be brought to justice.
His statement caused an uproar, and within days the White House was backpedaling and apologizing for the president's use of the word crusade, insisting that he only meant to say that the global fight against terrorism was a broad cause. Whether Freudian slip or innocent gaffe, the phrase struck a nerve throughout the Arab world, and no wonder. It only served to confirm their worst fears, that this global war emerging from the ashes of the fallen towers would be cast in the horrific but familiar terms of one religion's effort to wipe out another. And this was not hypersensitivity on the Muslim community's part. The very word crusade derives from the French word croisade, meaning marked by the cross. Only in modern times has it come to have the meaning broad cause. Historically, it has meant not a broad cause, but a very specific one, the righteous battle against evil, the holy war. Ever since the days of Ayatollah Khomeini, when pictures of American presidents were routinely burned in effigy and the United States first found itself being lambasted as the Great Satan, Americans have been genuinely perplexed by the hatred and vitriol displayed toward us by Islamic peoples of the East. From our vantage point, we're a noble, God-fearing nation, generous with our gifts to the poor and disaster-stricken of other countries. Americans give more aid per capita to the impoverished than do the citizens of many other countries of the world. We're a country of freedom, of apple pie and soccer moms, and who would hate that? But to the Muslim communities of the East, as I was now learning, this all smacks of a morally superior attitude buoyed by a blatant double standard. The United States condemns terror and its financing networks, yet the same thing occurs right in its own backyard. Many of the weapons Saddam used during his regime were provided directly or indirectly by the United States. Indeed, the Stinger missiles being used by Taliban forces against Americans were supplied by the Americans themselves back in the days when we were supporting Afghanistan in its efforts to fend off the invading Soviet Union. It has been said that one man's meat is another man's Persian, or to put a finer point on it, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. The United States classifies Hezbollah, whose name means the Party of God, as a terrorist organization. But this perspective cuts both ways. According to Avi Jurish, a specialist in Arab media who has worked with the Pentagon, Hezbollah views America as a terrorist state, and many Muslims view Israeli figures such as former Prime Minister Menachem Begin as terrorists. As the war of words heated to a boil in the days after 9/11, it seemed to me that arguments supporting or denying either point of view were missing the point, which was how widely and fiercely both perspectives were held. The West viewed Islam as being dedicated to the destruction of the West. The Islamic East saw the war on terror as being a war against their religion and their way of life. Noted Islamic scholar John Esposito summarized the dilemma this way. For the Christian West, Islam is the religion of the sword. For the Muslims, the Christian West is epitomized by the armies of the Crusades. It was shaping up as an intractable standoff. The Muslim world saw the West as unrepentantly expansionist, a people who would stop at nothing until we had forced our own cultural, economic, political, and religious way of life on all the populations of the planet. To the Muslim East, Christianity was not a true faith, but a faith that had been corrupted and hijacked to serve our imperialistic ways. I sat over lunch one day with Girma Asmeron, then the Eritrean ambassador to the United States, and listened as he confessed his deep-seated feelings about European colonialism. He said, "The white man brought us Christianity, the Bible, and prayer," Girma told me. He told us to read the Bible and look up and pray. We did. When we finished praying and looked down again, our land was gone. This was the view from the eastern side of the divide, and the view from the west seems scarcely any different. To the average citizen of the Judeo-Christian West, especially in these post-9/11 days, Islam seemed to have one underlying agenda: to conquer and utterly vanquish the West. These two viewpoints, how the Islamic East sees the Christian West and vice versa, continue to prevail today, and of course neither view is any more accurate than the other. Unfortunately, though, a handful of demagogues and radical clerics have hijacked the genuine faith of Islam and engaged us in a war of ideology, amplified by hateful Western condemnation of Islam, the Quran, and the Prophet Muhammad. And escalating rhetoric on both sides of the battle threatens to turn out the worst scenarios into self-fulfilling prophecies. There is perhaps no better example of this deliberate, emotionally supercharged distorting of crucial terms and concepts than the case of the word jihad. In the post-9/11 world, few terms evoke more of a visceral reaction on both sides of the East-West divide. Ask anyone on the street, East or West, what is jihad? And chances are excellent the answer you will get will be some variation of this. Jihad is the holy war of Islam against the infidels. That is, all non-Muslims, they would say. But is that true? What does the word actually mean? In the waning days of 2001, as the days grew shorter and the rhetoric on all sides grew hotter, it seemed critical to gain a complete understanding of this term jihad for myself. So I sat down to go through the entire Quran, page by page, and examine every single ayah that deals with this concept. What I learned was fascinating. Jihad is used in the Quran primarily to describe the struggle or striving against negative influences in the pursuit of internal purity. It is also commonly used in defensive terms, struggling against sin and vanity, avoiding contacts with unbelievers and other corrupting influences, much like the shunning practiced by the Amish in America. The term has many shades of meaning. In different surahs of the Quran, jihad is used in various ways to denote avoiding unbelievers and hypocrites, striving to convince and encourage, having faith, dealing with money and self, immigration, patience, and giving. Jihad covers the one who struggles in the righteous path of internal purification. the reward that awaits those who righteously struggle thus, and righteousness itself. Some passages in the Quran use jihad to describe defensive fighting in the cause of Allah, which is readily taken out of context to imply armed aggression. But this is poles apart from the genuine Quranic meaning. The struggle to defend family, friends, community, and honor against external attack is also jihad. But this use of the term appears as such in the Quran only rarely, and with far less vivid evocations of bloodshed than the same impulse is described in the Old Testament. What the term means primarily is an internal struggle, the effort to withstand external influences and come closer to God. When James, the brother of Jesus, invokes the word religion, he defines it as giving to orphans and widows, plus the effort to keep oneself pure in the world. This struggle to keep oneself pure, untainted and clear in mind, body, and soul, is jihad. Interestingly, the Peshitta version of the Bible uses an eerily similar word in Aramaic, jihad, which means to strive. In Daniel 7:2, Matthew 12:19, Colossians 1:29, Hebrews 12:4. But the Quran and the Bible seem to use the term jihad as a struggle or fight not against external forces or enemies, but for internal peace and to get closer to God. It's exactly this struggle that Paul describes so eloquently in his great letter to the believers in Rome. For it is not the good that I wish to do that I do, but it is the evil that I do not wish to do that I do. Romans 7:19. This same sense of jihad is apparent when Jesus finds himself alone in the Garden of Gethsemane, knowing of his betrayal and impending capture and struggling with himself to accept his fate. From Jesus to Paul to Augustine to Luther, all the great figures of Christianity have described their own vivid experiences with that same jihad described so beautifully in the florid classic Arabic of the Quran. As intriguing as it was to begin to understand the full scope, majesty, and especially cultural commonality of the term, it didn't take long to realize where the essential problem lay. Most Muslims today don't really know what the Quran says. If someone told you that the Bible laid out a blueprint for the programs of Europe that burned thousands of Jews at the stake, or for the Inquisition in Spain that expelled hundreds of thousands of Jews and forced conversions under torture, you might fiercely object, and of course you'd be right to do so. But during those horrendous times, very few people actually read the Bible, in any language, let alone the Semitic languages that best conveyed its original meaning, because the majority of the population was illiterate. When their leaders told them in the name of God they were supposed to go, torture, rape, and murder people, that's what they did. This is not at all that different from the situation today. Just as a lot of Westerners know the Bible only vaguely and consider themselves Christians because their parents were, or because they occasionally go to church, quite a few Muslims really don't understand the Quran well at all. Muslim clerics say that the Quran can be fully understood only in its original Arabic. Yet of the 1.2 billion Muslims worldwide, barely 15% can read Arabic, and a great many of that 15% would find the ornate language of classical 7th century Arabic daunting. Imagine how many modern Americans or Britons would be able to read Beowulf in its original Anglo-Saxon, and you get an idea of the scope of the problem. The plain truth is that few Muslims in today's world are genuinely conversant with the actual text of the Quran. Just like the Europeans of those earlier centuries, modern Muslims rely on their religious and political leadership to tell them what it says. In the same way, I would guess that far fewer than 1% of modern Christians can actually read the Aramaic or Greek New Testaments, and therefore they also rely on the interpretations of translations and religious leaders. In great part, the problem of Muslim terrorism is one of ignorance of their own holy book and the core tenets of faith. Islam has been dumbed down to serve the goals of radical militancy. Militants, when unable to justify their deviant interpretations with the Quran, also manipulate jihad through the lens of Islam's other important, though not inspired, books, the Hadith and the Sunnah. The Quran tells us that Muhammad was compassionate even in war. He prohibited the killing or ill treatment of women and children, and even forbade the cutting down of trees. The image of impressionable, fanatical young men and women striding into public places with explosives strapped to their chests to blow apart scores of randomly executed public, or of jumbo jets filled with innocent civilians hijacked and flown into buildings filled with thousands more, would have filled the prophet of Mecca and Medina with revulsion and horror. And this is the awful irony of it. Just as Adolf Hitler hijacked the concept of personal purity before God, or Christian purity, and distorted it into the justification for a campaign of genocide, the promoters of Muslim militancy have hijacked what is in essence the same principle: the personal struggle to reach and maintain inner purity, and harnessed it to a campaign of mass murder. In their blood-strewn agendas of militant aggression, the Crusaders, the Inquisitors, the Nazis, and the so-called jihadists all claim moral superiority and a mandate direct from on high, and it's all a lie. None of it has anything to do with God or Allah. None with Jesus or Muhammad, or purity, or jihad. It is wholly the invention of the bitter heart of human hatred, and it's time we expose the lie for what it is, instead of simply throwing screamed insults, threats, and bombs at it. The more I learned about this concept, its background and true meaning, the more I realized that we in the West were unwittingly encouraging, through our use of such phrases as the ideology of terror and similar characterizations of the Islamic terrorist agenda, the very distortions that lay at the heart of the problem. If these vulnerable Muslim men and women were being told by radical militants that jihad is a, quote, holy war against the infidels of the West, especially Christians and Jews, based on the Holy Quran, and then they heard a consistent chorus of confirmation from the West, telling them that, indeed, the Quran promotes violence, weren't we simply affirming the fanatics' distortion of their own holy book? Our strategy for addressing Muslim militancy should be based not on confirming their tafsir, or interpretation of the Quran, but on challenging it. Present a peaceful point of view and let the truth prevail. This has to be the first step toward mitigating terrorism. Of course, there is more to Muslim terrorism than a manipulated mantra. If there were many facets to the cultural rift between East and West that are evoked to inflame anti-Western sentiment and the perceived need to defend against Western aggression, and these all help to feed the fires of holy war. But there is one driving force beyond all the others, behind the extremists' most fearsome and unstoppable weapon. That weapon is the suicide attacker, the martyr soldier, and the driving force behind it is that powerful and time-tested motivation for militancy, the promise of salvation. Every single surah in the Quran, but the 9th, begins with these words, Bismillah al-Rahman al-Rahim. In the name of Allah, the benevolent and merciful. However, although Allah is merciful, there is a common belief in Islam that one cannot know for sure whether that forgiveness will be applied to oneself individually until Judgment Day. This determination may be influenced, for example, by how faithful one has been to the 5 pillars of Islam. Actually, there are Quranic passages that are quite clear on the surety of salvation. For example, Surah 3, Ayah 31 says, Allah will love you and forgive your sins, for Allah is oft forgiving and most merciful. And look at the majestically redemptive message in this passage. Those who believe, it's talking about in the Quran, and those who follow the Jewish scriptures, and the Christians and the Sabians, the Aramaic-speaking sects of Christians, any who believe in Allah and the last day and work righteousness shall have their reward with the Lord, and on them shall be no fear, nor shall they grieve. Surah 2, Ayah 62. However, on this topic, as on most, the Quran tends to be somewhat Delphic and open to interpretation. The architects of militant Muslim ideology have honed in on the uncertainty of salvation concept and provided a black and white answer. There is only one way to guarantee that Allah's benevolent mercy will be applied to one's individual case, and that is martyrdom, specifically to give up one's life in the act of destroying infidels. This, they say, is jihad, the holy war, the righteous cause, the one sure path to eternal bliss, which of course is pure nonsense. The Quran doesn't prescribe murder or suicide as a path to salvation any more than the Bible does. But that didn't stop Pope Urban II from claiming that anyone who took up arms to participate in the Church's war against the East, in what history would later call the First Crusade, would automatically earn full penance. And it hasn't stopped Muslim extremists from successfully promoting the idea of jihad as its own brand of religiously sanctioned, holy cause justified, God-endorsed rationale for mass murder. As some friends and I sat over dinner in Bahrain with a group of Muslim political, business, and religious leaders, I was struck with a thought about this terrible cycle of doctrine-inspired fanaticism. Much of the rationale of Muslim militancy and martyrdom rests on the nobility of defending Islam from infidels, which includes killing them. But if their definition of infidels is simply all those who are not Muslims, I thought, what happens when we take a closer look at the definition of what it means to be a Muslim? After waiting for an appropriate lull in the conversation, I posed this question to the group. Let's imagine we had a Jew, a Christian, and a Muslim sitting together around a table much like this, talking about their traditions and their different holy scriptures. Then let's imagine that the Muslim is explaining what it means to be a Muslim, telling the other two about the Muslim witness of faith, the Shahada, and the Jew suddenly exclaims, "Wait, in our own holy book it says almost exactly the same thing." The men stopped me, vigorously shaking their heads and saying, no, not possible. I said, I can prove it to you. One of them said, well, you're going to have to, because as far as I can see, this is impossible. I said, would you agree that Moses and Jesus were both Jews? He nodded, and I continued. The Quran says that they were both Muslims. Somewhere here in their practice of Judaism, mustn't they have said the Shahada? The men were silent. In Deuteronomy it says, may I speak Hebrew? Of course, they said. I went on to explain the meaning of Shema, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. How it is virtually identical to Shahada, there is no God but Allah, and that they both say essentially the same thing. And that when asked what was the greatest commandment of all, Jesus, as recorded in Mark's Gospel, repeated the Shema, and went on to define the state of complete surrender to God in heart, mind, soul, and action. That is the essence of the word Muslim. Back to our circle of friends, I said, if they all discover they're saying essentially the same Shahada and embracing the same state of being in submission to God, the same Shalim, what would that make them? They were silent at first, and then began whispering to each other in Arabic. Finally, one man, a highly esteemed Sudanese sheikh, spoke up and said they would be in essence Muslims. Now, I'm not saying that they would be Muslims in every sense, I hasten to add. Certainly not culturally and not in every aspect of their practice. They would retain their own cultural values, religions, and traditions. But at the very least, one couldn't really consider any of them infidels, could one? No, came his stunned reply, one couldn't. As stunned as my Sikh friend was at this moment, I was even more excited at its implications. What happens to the martyr's case, I reasoned, if we were to suddenly have no clear definition of infidel? If one man's infidel turns out to be another man's Muslim? If there is no one to kill, no one to blow up with our suicide bombs, no one for us to use as targets while we martyr ourselves gloriously in our righteous cause? The driving force behind the terrifying power of Muslim extremism is also its Achilles heel. Because if we can demonstrate a critical flaw in this idea, the whole strategy begins to unravel. And what could be a more fatal flaw in the logic of the Muslim suicide bomber than the idea that a Jew or Christian might be, as this group of esteemed Muslim holy men in Bahrain confirmed, in essence a Muslim? My American imam friend told me he described such a person as, quote, a spiritual Muslim. It's not about comparing or contrasting anything, he said. Being a spiritual Muslim is a state where an individual totally and unconditionally surrenders himself to God as his only master and creator. It is that special feeling of indebtedness for his very existence that develops in a spiritual Muslim an inner sense of humility toward God and the universe, he said. One who enters into this state of being, said Abdel, becomes a humble human being, working to the benefit of others simply because he or she was created equal by the same one God. Thus, a genuine sense of love, brotherhood, and peace naturally develops for every other individual fellow human without exception. Indeed, this process could be the spark of hope to curtail the East's view of a modern crusade by a militaristic expansionist West and the West's view of a mysterious distant religion bent on their destruction. It seemed to me that this common ground of better understanding held the power to dispel Western ignorance and to dismantle the entire machinery of the Muslim extremist with its armies of willing suicide bombers. When we accept this idea of a, quote, spiritual Muslim, it's easy to see that anyone of faith, whether in the Jewish or Christian tradition, or for that matter any other tradition, can enter into this same state of being and become submitted to God, a fellow seeker pursuing his own jihad on the path to shalom.